Sometimes history feels like a dusty old book, full of dates and names that don't quite connect with our lives today. But then there are moments, pivotal moments, that just grab you by the collar and shake you, making you realize how fragile and interconnected our world truly is. Imagine for a moment a quiet village nestled in the heart of Europe. The year is 1347. Farmers are tilling their fields, merchants are trading their wares, and life, for all its medieval challenges, carries on. People are concerned about the harvest, about their families, about the everyday struggles of existence. They're certainly not worried about a microscopic enemy that's about to sweep across continents, leaving devastation in its wake, wiping out more than half of Europe's population and utterly transforming society as they knew it. A disease so terrifying, so swift, that it would earn the chilling moniker, the Black Death. I'm Danny, and this is a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Can you imagine living through something like that? What would it feel like to see your neighbors, your friends, your family members succumbing to an invisible foe with no known cure? How would society cope with a third, a half, even two-thirds of its people vanished in a matter of years? And what lessons, if any, can we draw from such a catastrophic event in human history that might resonate with our own experiences today? These, my friends, are some of the burning questions we're going to tackle in today's episode of English Plus Podcast. We're going to dive deep into the harrowing yet utterly fascinating story of the Black Death in medieval Europe. We'll journey through its terrifying spread, explore its devastating impact on society, and uncover the unexpected ways it reshaped the world. We'll then look at some incredible case studies that show how societies respond to unimaginable crises. And then, as always, we'll turn our attention to language. We'll be focusing on some rich vocabulary and powerful speaking techniques to discuss this and other complex topics, and then we'll sharpen our writing skills with a challenge inspired by this historical turning point. So buckle up, my friends, because this is going to be an intense, eye-opening, and truly transformative episode that will not only expand your knowledge, but also take your English to the next level. So let's get started. All right, let's cast our minds back to the mid-14th century. We're talking about a world without antibiotics, without germ theory, without anything resembling modern medicine. People believed disease was a punishment from God or caused by bad air, what they called miasma. Into this world, a microscopic killer was about to unleash itself with unprecedented fury. Our story, or rather the plague story, often begins in Central Asia, somewhere around the vast steppes. Imagine nomadic communities, their herds, and, crucially, their fleas. Yes, you heard me right. Fleas. The culprit, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, lives in the guts of fleas, which in turn live on rodents, particularly black rats. These rats, incredibly adaptable and fond of human company, were the perfect vectors. So picture this. Trade routes, the Silk Road connecting east and west, merchants eager for exotic goods unwittingly became carriers of a silent, deadly cargo. The plague likely traveled along these routes slowly, relentlessly, from Central Asia through China, across India, and eventually to the Middle East. It arrived in Europe in 1347, initially reaching the port city of Kaffa in Crimea. Legend has it, and historical accounts support this, that during a siege of Kaffa by the Mongol Golden Horde, plague-ridden corpses were catapulted over the city walls. Talk about biological warfare. Well, medieval style. Now, whether this was the primary means of transmission or simply a horrific accelerant, the plague was in. From Kaffa, it hitched a ride on Genoese trading ships. Well, think about it. A ship filled with grain, goods, and, inevitably, rats. These ships docked in major European ports. Messina in Sicily, the Pisa, Genoa, and Venice in Italy, and then Marseille in France. and with each port of call, the silent passenger disembarked. Can you imagine the panic as reports started trickling in? Sailors arriving with strange, dark swellings in their armpits and groins, a fever, and then death, often within days. What would your reaction be if you saw something like this happening in your town, knowing absolutely nothing about how it spreads? Would you flee? Would you pray? Would you try to understand what was happening? The plague wasn't just one disease. It manifested in different forms. The most common and terrifying was the bubonic plague, named after the characteristic painful swellings or buboes that appeared. These were often in the groin, armpits, and neck. This form was transmitted by flea bites. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and spread directly from person to person through the air, coughs and sneezes. This was incredibly virulent and almost always fatal. And finally, the septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing widespread bleeding and blackening of the skin, hence Black Death. This form was also nearly always fatal. Now, the speed of its spread was horrifying. From the Italian ports, it radiated outwards, following trade routes, rivers, and roads. Within months, it had consumed Italy. By 1348, it was tearing through France, Spain, and North Africa. England and Ireland fell victim in 1349, Scandinavia and Eastern Europe by 1350. It was an unstoppable force, a truly global pandemic long before the term was even conceived. The sheer scale of the initial devastation is almost impossible to grasp. Estimates vary, but a widely accepted figure suggests that between 30 and 50% of Europe's population perished in just a few short years. Some regions lost even more, up to 75% or 80%. Imagine every other person you know, or even 2 out of every 3, gone. The sheer human cost is staggering. Think about the psychological impact on those who survived. How do you rebuild a society when so much has been lost? What do you think would be the immediate emotional and psychological consequences of such an event on individuals and communities? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next, the consequences and cultural shifts. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. The Black Death wasn't just a medical catastrophe. It was a societal earthquake. The immediate aftermath was chaos. With so many dead, there was a severe shortage of labor. Fields lay fallow, harvests rotted, and workshops stood empty. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It had profound long-term consequences. Before the plague, Europe had been characterized by a feudal system. Peasants or serfs were tied to the land, working for a lord in exchange for protection and a place to live. They had very little freedom and even less bargaining power. But suddenly, with the population decimated, labor became a precious commodity. If you were one of the surviving peasants, what would you demand? Higher wages, of course, more freedom. And that's exactly what happened. Landlords, desperate for workers, were forced to offer better terms, higher wages, and even freedom from serfdom to entice people to work their lands. This shift in power dynamics from the land-owning elite to the common laborer was revolutionary. It weakened the feudal system considerably, paving the way for a more mobile and economically dynamic society. Do you think this shift was a direct result of the plague, or was it merely an acceleration of trends that were already underway? What other factors might have contributed to the decline of feudalism? Well, think about that. And of course, let me know in the comments. But now, beyond economics, the plague had a deep impact on culture and religion. The church, which had been the bedrock of medieval society, found its authority challenged. People had prayed, gone on pilgrimages, made offerings, and still the plague devoured them. Many began to question why God would inflict such suffering. Some saw it as divine punishment, leading to extreme piety, flagellant movements, groups who publicly whipped themselves to atone for sins. and persecution of minority groups, particularly Jewish communities, who were scapegoated and accused of poisoning wells. On the other hand, others reacted with a hedonistic embrace of life, believing that since death could strike at any moment, they should enjoy themselves while they could. Think about the juxtaposition: profound religious fervor alongside rampant revelry. This period saw a morbid fascination with death reflected in art and literature, with images of the dance of death becoming common. Artists depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life: kings, peasants, popes, in a macabre dance to the grave. Now, what does this art tell us about the collective psychology of the time? How do societies express their deepest fears and anxieties through art? Now, that's a question to ponder as well, and another question for you to answer in the comments. And now let's talk about the impact on education and intellectual life. Well, that was also significant. Universities suffered immense losses as many scholars and teachers perished. However, paradoxically, the vacancies created opportunities for new talent and perspectives. Furthermore, the decline in Latin, the language of scholarship, led to the rise of vernacular languages as people needed to communicate more effectively in their everyday lives. This eventually contributed to a blossoming of national literatures and identities. It's fascinating how even in such profound devastation, seeds of change for the better can be sown, isn't it? And now, my friends, let's talk about the long-term legacy of Black Death. Despite the unimaginable devastation, European society didn't collapse entirely. In fact, in many ways, it emerged stronger, more resilient, and set on a different trajectory. The Black Death acted as a harsh, albeit brutal, catalyst for change. One of the most significant long-term effects was the demographic shift. While the initial death toll was horrific, the reduced population meant more resources for the survivors. Land became more abundant, wages remained relatively high for laborers, and per capita wealth generally increased. This led to an improved standard of living for many ordinary people. They had more disposable income, better diets, and even access to more land. This shift in economic power laid some of the groundwork for the eventual decline of the feudal system and the rise of a more market-driven economy. Well, think about the innovation that springs from necessity. With fewer hands to work the land, there was an increased incentive to develop labor-saving technologies. While the direct link is debated, the period after the plague saw innovations in agriculture and manufacturing that contributed to greater efficiency. The focus shifted from sheer manual labor to smarter ways of producing goods and food. Perhaps one of the most profound, though indirect, legacies of the Black Death was its contribution to the Renaissance. The social and economic upheaval, the questioning of traditional authorities, and the newfound wealth among certain segments of the population created fertile ground for intellectual and artistic rebirth. With the decline of the church's absolute authority, people began to look more to human reason and individual achievement. The emphasis shifted from the purely spiritual to a renewed interest in classical learning, humanism, and scientific inquiry. Now, while it's certainly not a cause and effect relationship, the plague undeniably played a role in disrupting the old order and making space for new ideas to flourish. Now, what parallels, if any, can we draw between the societal changes brought about by the Black Death and the transformations we've seen in our own time, particularly in the wake of global crises? Are there common patterns in how humanity reacts to and recovers from widespread adversity? Well, think about it. Maybe world wars come to mind. Maybe COVID-19. Well, think about that. Well, my friends, the Black Death also profoundly influenced public health and medicine, albeit slowly. Now, while medieval doctors had no idea what caused the plague, the sheer scale of the deaths forced them to observe, document, and try new approaches. The concept of quarantine, for example, originated during this period. Cities like Venice implemented strict measures to isolate incoming ships and travelers to prevent the spread of disease. Now, while crude by modern standards, it was a crucial step towards understanding disease transmission and implementing preventative measures. This was a radical shift from the miasma theory. The plague, in its own terrible way, pushed humanity towards a more empirical understanding of disease. So while the Black Death was an unparalleled catastrophe, it also inadvertently paved the way for significant societal, economic, and cultural transformations. It was a brutal reset button that reshaped the course of European history, influencing everything from labor rights to artistic movements and early public health initiatives. Understanding this period isn't just about learning about the past. It's about understanding how profound crises can both destroy and create, shaping the very fabric of human civilization. Well, my friends, that, in a nutshell, of course, is everything you need to know about the Black Death. But next, let's get practical. And you might be wondering, how can we get practical about the Black Death? Well, stick around and you'll find out. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. All right, we've journeyed through the terrifying landscape of the Black Death, from its devastating spread to its profound societal impact. But why does this history, hundreds of years old, matter to us today? How can understanding a medieval pandemic be practical in our modern lives? This section, Let's Get Practical, is where we connect the dots between the past and the present. The Black Death, in its sheer scale and transformative power, offers us invaluable case studies on how societies react to existential threats, how resilience is forged in the crucible of crisis, and the enduring lessons about human nature and our interconnected world. So let's dive into a few key takeaways and how they relate to our contemporary experiences. Now let's start with the first case study, the power of information or lack thereof. Imagine facing an invisible enemy with no understanding of its origin, its transmission, or how to stop it. That was the reality during the Black Death. The lack of accurate information fueled panic, superstition, and tragically, the scapegoating of minority groups. People looked for answers anywhere they could, whether in religious interpretations, astrological signs, or blaming outsiders. Now, in our modern world, we're inundated with information, both accurate and inaccurate. The Black Death highlights the critical importance of reliable information and scientific understanding, especially during a crisis. Think about how vital, clear, consistent communication from health authorities was during recent global health emergencies. What happens when misinformation spreads faster than facts? We saw echoes of medieval anxieties, albeit with different villains, when people searched for quick explanations or cures during more recent pandemics, like the COVID-19, of course. Well, this tells us that despite centuries of scientific progress, the human need for understanding and the potential for fear-driven irrationality remains constant. So what can we do about that? How can we be more discerning consumers of information? How can we support accurate reporting and critical thinking? When faced with a new challenge, our first step should always be to seek out credible sources, question assumptions, and understand the mechanisms at play rather than succumbing to fear or blaming. Now let's move on to another case study. Now we discussed how the Black Death dramatically shifted power from landowners to laborers, leading to higher wages and the decline of serfdom. Well, this wasn't a benevolent gift. It was a consequence of economic necessity due to a massive population decline. Well, this historical event demonstrates the fundamental principle of supply and demand, even in the most dire circumstances. It shows how power dynamics can shift dramatically when a critical resource, in this case human labor, becomes scarce. Think about current discussions around labor shortages in various industries and how that is empowering workers to demand better conditions and pay. Now, while certainly not as catastrophic, and hopefully will never be, but the underlying economic forces are similar. The Black Death illustrates how profound external shocks can accelerate societal changes that might otherwise take centuries. So, this historical lesson encourages us to critically examine current economic shifts and power dynamics. When you hear about changes in the job market or shifts in worker demands, consider the underlying forces at play. Are there shocks to the system that are rebalancing the scales? Understanding these historical precedents can give us a deeper appreciation for the complex interplay between societal structure, economics, and human well-being. Now let's take a look at Black Death from another perspective. Now, despite the unimaginable losses, European society didn't collapse. It adapted, innovated, and eventually thrived in new ways. The period after the Black Death saw advancements in agriculture, the rise of new social structures, and even indirectly the seeds of the Renaissance. Now, the story of the Black Death is ultimately a testament to human resilience. It shows that even in the face of catastrophic loss, humanity finds ways to rebuild, to learn, and to innovate. Now, this is a powerful message for our own times. When we face global challenges, whether they be climate change, new diseases, or economic instability, remembering the resilience of those who survived the Black Death can be incredibly inspiring. It reminds us that humanity has a remarkable capacity for adaptation and problem solving. So, how can we foster resilience in our own communities and personal lives? Well, this isn't just about bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward. It's about learning from adversity, strengthening our social bonds, and embracing new ways of thinking. The Black Death reminds us that while some things are beyond our control, our collective ability to adapt, to innovate, and to support one another is our greatest strength. It has always been this way, and it will always be. Don't count on anything else. That's our greatest strength, not our technology and weapons. Of course, they might sound strong, but they're not strong enough. Our greatest strength will always be our collective ability to do anything, to adapt, to innovate, to support one another. That's important. So, my friends, in essence, learning about the Black Death isn't just about memorizing dates or understanding a terrible disease. It's about understanding the fundamental drivers of human society, how we cope with crisis, how information or misinformation shapes our reality, how economic forces can utterly reshape power, and most importantly, the enduring power of human resilience. These are timeless lessons, relevant today as they were in the 14th century, helping us navigate our own complex world with a deeper understanding of our shared past and potential future. And with that, we come to the end of our topic. But of course, that's just the end of our topic. But next, we're going to focus on language. We're going to talk about vocabulary, important words that we can learn from our topic today. We're going to have our speaking challenge, and then we're going to move on to our grammar and writing challenges. And we're going to finish with some discussion questions to share with you. So you don't want to miss that. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Welcome back to our language focus segment. In this part, we're going to dissect some key vocabulary and phrases we've used throughout our discussion of the Black Death, and then we'll transition into a speaking lesson that will help you articulate complex historical and societal topics with greater fluency and precision. So let's start with the vocabulary. Let's start with the very first word, harrowing, which is an adjective. Harrowing, harrowing. Now, we use this word when describing the harrowing story of the Black Death. What does that mean? Well, it means extremely distressing or terrifying. Think of something that causes great mental distress or anxiety. That's harrowing. In context, we can say, the harrowing journey across the desert left them exhausted and near death. Well, you can use harrowing to describe an experience, a story, or even a period in history as harrowing if it was incredibly difficult, frightening, or painful. For example, we can say, the documentary depicted the harrowing conditions faced by refugees. All right, so that was about harrowing, our first word, but of course, we still have more. Next, we have pivotal. 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 That's an adjective. Well, we call the Black Death a pivotal event. Well, what does that mean? Well, we use this word to talk about something of crucial importance in relation to the development or success of something else, a central thing. It's like a pivot point around which things turn. That's why we call it pivotal. In context, we can say something like, the invention of the printing press was a pivotal moment in human history. So, my friends, use pivotal to describe events, decisions, or figures that are fundamental to a larger outcome. For example, we can say, her decision to invest early proved pivotal to the company's success. Next, let's talk about another adjective, and that one is ubiquitous. 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 Now, while we didn't explicitly say ubiquitous rats, well, the idea of them being everywhere was implied. So I just wanted to add this word. But let's imagine we describe the rats as ubiquitous. What does that mean? It means present, appearing, or found everywhere. Now, in context, we can use it and say, in medieval cities, rats were ubiquitous, an unfortunate fact of life. Well, you can use this word to talk about smartphones. For example, you can say smartphones have become ubiquitous in modern society, or coffee shops are ubiquitous in this neighborhood. You can find a lot of them here, all right? That's ubiquitous. Now let's move on to talk about another word, and this one is a verb, decimate. D-E-C-I-M-A-T-E, decimate. Now we mentioned how the plague decimated the population. That means to kill, to destroy, or remove a large percentage or part of something. Originally, it meant to kill 1 in every 10, but now it's used to mean a substantial reduction. It doesn't have to be 1 in 10, right? But that was the original use anyway. Now, in context, we can use it and say the wildfire decimated the forest, leaving behind only charred trees. We can also say the company's profits were decimated by the economic downturn, or lack of water could decimate the crop. So that's decimate, my friends. Next, let's talk about scourge. S-C-O-U-R-G-E. Well, this is a term often used to describe the plague. What does that mean? Well, it means a person or thing that causes great trouble or suffering. It can also refer to a whip used for punishment. We can call that a scourge. Now, in context, we can use it and say, the Black Death was a true scourge upon humanity. We can also use it and say, poverty remains a terrible scourge in many parts of the world, or drug addiction is a scourge that affects countless families. Now, going from this negative word to a positive word, or usually a positive word, it's kind of neutral. But anyway, catalyst, C-A-T-A-L-Y-S-T, catalyst. Now, we refer to the Black Death as a catalyst for change. What does that mean? Well, a catalyst means a person or thing that precipitates an event or change. In chemistry, a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction without itself undergoing any permanent chemical change, that's a catalyst. But of course, we're not interested in chemistry now, I'm just saying. But in context, we can say, for example, his innovative ideas served as a catalyst for the company's growth. We can also use it and say the new policy was a catalyst for widespread protests, or her encouragement acted as a catalyst for his artistic development. Okay? Now, let's move on next to the feudal system. F-E-U-D-A-L, and system, you know how to write that. Now, we discussed how the plague weakened the feudal system. Well, what is the meaning of feudal system? Well, that's the dominant societal system in medieval Europe, in which the nobility held lands from the crown in exchange for military service, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants, which were called serfs, were obliged to live on their lord's land and give him homage, labor, and a share of the produce, notionally in exchange for military protection. Now, in context, we can use it and say, the end of the feudal system brought greater freedoms to the common people. Or we can also say, understanding the feudal system is key to grasping medieval European history. Okay, that was the feudal system, my friends. Next, let's move on and talk about resilience. R-E-S-I-L-I-E-N-C-E, resilience. We emphasized human resilience in the face of the plague. Well, what does that mean? Well, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. The toughness you have, that's the resilience we're talking about. Now, in context, we say, for example, despite numerous setbacks, her resilience allowed her to overcome all obstacles. Or we can say the city showed remarkable resilience after the earthquake. Or we can say building emotional resilience is crucial for mental well-being. All right, my friends, that was about resilience. Next, let's talk about trajectory. T-R-A-J-E-C-T-O-R-Y, trajectory. Now, we said that the plague set society on a different trajectory. So what does that mean? What is the meaning of trajectory? Well, that's the path followed by a projectile flying or an object moving under the action of given forces. I know, that's kind of technical, right? But more broadly, it means a path or sequence of events. So keep that in mind. But the original meaning is something technical. But anyway, we can use it and say, the company's new strategy set it on a different trajectory for growth. Or we can say, his career trajectory has been nothing short of meteoric, which is very fast. Or the global economy is on a challenging trajectory. Okay? So that was about trajectory. Next, we have precedent. 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 Now, we use this when discussing historical precedents. But what does that mean? Well, a precedent is an earlier event or action that is regarded as an example or guide to be considered in subsequent similar circumstances. They use that a lot in courts. For example, we can say the court's ruling set a legal precedent for similar cases in the future. Or we can say there's no historical precedent for a situation like this. It's happening for the first time, or at least that's what we know. Or we can say her innovative work set a new precedent for the industry. Okay? These are the words that I wanted to share with you. 10 words that are very useful. You can use them. Of course, very useful in our context, in what we're talking about, not only the Black Death, but things from history and stuff. But of course, they are also useful in many other areas as well. Now let's move on to our speaking focus section. Let's turn these words into action and enhance your speaking skills. Now, when discussing historical events like the Black Death, it's not just about reciting facts. It's about explaining cause and effect, analyzing impact, and drawing parallels to contemporary issues. Now, here are some techniques and phrases to help you speak more effectively about such topics. Now, first, let's start with establishing context. We can use things like to truly understand, and of course, here use the event you want to talk about, we need to cast our minds back to whatever. Or you can say something like, imagine for a moment a world where, and then you continue talking about whatever you want to talk about. Or you can say, before this event occurred, whatever the event is, the situation was characterized by. Well, these are just example phrases. I'm not saying these are the only phrases, of course not. But these are very useful phrases that you can use to establish context, which is very important when you want to talk about history. Well, next we come to describing the impact or the consequence. For example, we can say, the immediate aftermath was one of whatever. Or this wasn't just an inconvenience. It had profound long-term consequences. And then you start talking about the consequences. Or you can say, the sheer scale of the devastation is almost impossible to grasp. Of course, you give more details. Or you can say, it acted as a harsh, albeit brutal, catalyst for change. Or the most significant long-term effect was whatever. Or you can say, this had a ripple effect leading to whatever. Now, of course, I'm using many of the examples that I used in the topic because these do not apply just to this topic, to the Black Death, but anything we want to talk about that is related to history. Okay? So we started by establishing context. Then we described the impact or consequence. Now let's move on to analyzing and drawing parallels. Let's talk about some example phrases or sentences that you can use to analyze and draw parallels. You can say, for example, what lessons, if any, can we draw from this event? Are there common patterns in how humanity reacts to and recovers from widespread adversity? We can see echoes of, you name the historical event, in a modern situation. And of course, you name the modern situation. Or you can say, this illustrates the fundamental principle of whatever the principle is, of course. Or you can say, it's fascinating how even in such profound devastation, seeds of change for the better can be sown. And finally, you can say, understanding this period isn't just about learning about the past, it's about understanding whatever you want your audience to understand. And finally, don't forget to engage the listeners, the people who are listening to you. It can be you, the audience of a podcast. They might be in the thousands or the millions, or the audience can be very small. It can be 1 or 2 people, but it doesn't matter. They are your audience. Even if these people are your close friends and they're going to listen to no matter what, but try to engage the listener all the time. For example, you can say things like, can you imagine living through something like that? When you say something like that, you engage the listeners. You kind of like put them right in the middle of the action of this historical event. And they're not just learning about it. No, they're part of it. Or you can say, for example, what would your reaction be if whatever you want to say? Or you can say, how do you think this would impact? And of course, you continue. Or you say, do you think this was a direct result of whatever or an acceleration of trends? Now here, of course, you're going to need to make some slight changes to these phrases I gave you based on the topic you want to talk about. even if it is about history. But of course, depending on what historical event you want to talk about, it can be different. But these are just examples that can help you. And now for my speaking challenge. Now, your challenge is to choose another significant historical event. It could be a natural disaster, a technological revolution, a major war, or a social movement, and using at least 5 of the vocabulary words we discussed and at least 3 of the speaking phrases. Record yourself giving a short 2 to 3 minute explanation of its impact. Focus on explaining not just what happened, but why it was significant and what lessons we can learn from it today. Think about how you can make it engaging for an audience, just like we tried to do with the Black Death. Share your recordings with a language partner, a teacher, or even just listen back to yourself to identify areas for improvement. This will help you practice articulating complex ideas clearly and cohesively. And of course, you can share the recordings with me. I will listen to them, I will tell you what I think, I will give you some pointers to make them even better. But of course, the only way to share your recordings with me will be through my Patreon page. But now we come to the end of our vocabulary and speaking section, but not the end of our language section, because next we're going to talk about grammar and writing. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. And now, my friends, let's shift our focus to grammar and writing. For our writing challenge this week, we're going to dive into a reflective piece that draws inspiration from the Black Death. I'm calling the writing challenge a survivor's reflection. Imagine you are a survivor of the Black Death in medieval Europe. Write a journal entry or a letter to a distant relative reflecting on your experiences during and immediately after the plague. Describe the changes you've witnessed in your village or town, the impact on your family and community, and your hopes or fears for the future. Now, let me share some tips and tricks for success in this writing challenge should you choose to take it. First, embrace first-person perspective. This challenge is all about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, so use I, my, me throughout the writing. This will make your writing more immediate and personal. And show, don't tell. Instead of saying it was terrible, describe what made it terrible. Did you see bodies in the streets? Did your neighbors abandon their homes? What did you hear, smell, feel? For example, instead of people were dying, try the church bells tolled ceaselessly, each chime announcing another soul claimed by the sickness. This is a lot better, right? But of course, you can do it your own way. And next, use vivid imagery and sensory details. Engage your reader's senses. What did the streets look like? What were the sounds of mourning or eerie silence? What was the stench of death or the smell of burning effigies? Use descriptive adjectives and strong verbs. And of course, you can use figurative language appropriately. Similes and metaphors can add depth. For example, the plague swept through our village like a reaper's scythe. Or fear was a suffocating cloak. But just don't overdo it, okay? And my next tip is to focus on emotional impact. How would a survivor feel? Despair, fear, hope, resilience, bitterness, gratitude. Let these emotions come through in your writing. And my next point, I'm going to focus a little bit on grammar, the past perfect and conditional sentences. Now, to effectively write about past events and reflect on what could have been or what was different, the past perfect tense and conditional sentences are incredibly useful. Now, let's start with the past perfect, which is had plus past participle. Now, you can use the past perfect to talk about an action that happened before another action in the past. It helps to sequence events. For example, you can say, before the plague arrived, our village had been a bustling place. Now it was eerily quiet. Well, the arrival happened before the village became quiet. Well, in the writing, you can use that to contrast the before and after of the plague. You can say, for example, I remember how the market had been so vibrant, those vibrant days before the illness claimed so many traders. Now, the structure here is, remember, subject plus had past participle, and of course, the rest of the sentence. Now, let's move on to our conditional sentences, another tool you can use to make your writing even better. Well, this type of conditional is perfect for discussing hypothetical situations in the past. What would have happened if something had been different? Well, of course, we're talking about something in the past, so there's no way we could change it. So it helps you express regret, relief, or speculate on alternative histories. The structure is we use the if with past perfect, which is again had plus past participle. And in the result phrase, we use the subject with would have and past participle. For example, we can say, if we had known more about the disease, perhaps fewer people would have died. But the reality is different, of course. We didn't know, so they did die. Okay? In your writing, you can say something like, if I had listened to my uncle and had fled to the mountains earlier, perhaps my brother would have survived. Or you can say, the harvests would have been much better if so many farmers hadn't perished. So, again, that's the writing challenge, my friends, and I hope those tools that I shared with you are useful. Now, again, your task is to write a journal entry or letter of approximately 300 to 500 words. Pay close attention to using vivid language, strong verbs, and incorporating at least 2 examples of the past perfect tense and 2 type 3 conditional sentences to express the survivor's reflections and the dramatic changes they've witnessed. Now, once you're done, read it aloud, and you can see it for yourself. Does it sound authentic? Does it convey the emotions and the historical context? This exercise will not only enhance your grammar, but also your ability to craft compelling narrative. And of course, again, for my subscribers on Patreon, you can send me your writing, but please don't send me anything AI generated, because if it is AI generated, what are you waiting for? What am I going to add to it? Usually the writing is very good and there's nothing to add there. So please just send me things that you write. You write on your own with a lot of mistakes. That's the point, right? Don't worry about the mistakes. When we make mistakes, that means we're making progress. Remember that. So if you want to share your writing with me on Patreon, of course, you can do that. You can send me the writing. And now, my friends, it's almost the end of our episode, but we still have the discussion part. I'm going to leave you with some discussion questions. Of course, I can't leave you empty-handed, right? That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. All right, my friends, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the terrifying journey of the Black Death to its profound impact and enduring lessons. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. I want to hear your thoughts, your insights, and your unique perspectives. Now, these questions are designed to get you thinking deeply and critically about what we've discussed. So feel free to share your answers in the comment section on the website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com, or wherever you're listening to the show, and of course, on our Patreon page. Now, let me start with the first question. Beyond the obvious devastation, what do you believe was the single most surprising or unexpected long-term consequence of the Black Death for European society? And why do you find it so surprising? The next question is, in the episode, we discussed how the lack of information during the Black Death fueled fear and superstition. In what ways do you see parallels between this historical phenomenon and the challenges of misinformation in our own time, particularly during global crises? What do you think is the best way to combat it? And now for the next question. If you were a peasant surviving the Black Death, suddenly finding yourself with more bargaining power, what would be the first thing you would demand from your lord? And how do you think that one demand, if met, could start to unravel the feudal system from the ground up? Well, let's get a little bit creative here. And now to the next question. The Black Death led to changes in art, literature, and even religious beliefs. If a similar widespread catastrophe were to occur today, how do you envision it shaping our modern culture, art, or philosophical outlook? What aspects of our current society might be most vulnerable, and which might be most resilient? My final question is, we talked about human resilience. What personal qualities or societal structures do you think are the most crucial for a community to demonstrate true resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity, whether it's a pandemic, a natural disaster, or an economic collapse? Can resilience be learned, or is it an innate quality? Well, my friends, I hope that you discuss these questions with me, of course, or with anyone who is interested, with a friend, with one of your family, anybody who's interested. And if you find no one else, you can discuss that with yourself. Or, of course, you can use artificial intelligence. You can have a conversation with AI about these questions. But don't just ask and wait for artificial intelligence to answer you. Have a conversation. Challenge what it says. And always be a critical thinker when you use artificial intelligence. It is a very good tool, of course, but remember that it's just a tool. You're the one who's going to wield this tool. But anyway, what I'm saying is that there are many ways we can discuss that. Of course, if you would like to discuss that with me, I'm always available to answer your comments. But apart from that, that's everything I wanted to share with you about the Black Death and, of course, the language that we learned from it and the speaking challenge, writing challenge, etc. That brings us, my friends, to the end of another fascinating and hopefully enlightening episode of English Plus Podcast. Remember, today we journeyed back to the harrowing, remember the word? To the harrowing 14th century to explore the Black Death. A pivotal, well, that's another word, a pivotal moment in human history that reminds us of both our vulnerability and our incredible resilience. We learned how a microscopic foe decimated populations, but also inadvertently paved the way for profound societal shifts, from the decline of feudalism to the seeds of the Renaissance. I hope you not only gained a deeper understanding of this indelible historical event, but also expanded your English vocabulary and honed your speaking and writing skills. Remember, my friends, learning is an ongoing journey, and your engagement makes it even better. Don't forget to head over to EnglishPlusPodcast.com to check out the full transcript, additional resources, and to leave your answers to our discussion questions. We love reading your comments and hearing your perspectives. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and subscribing to unlock access to all English Plus Podcast premium content. Your support allows us to continue bringing you rich, informative, and English-enhancing content every single day. Thank you for tuning in, for being a part of the English Plus community, and for continuing your journey to take your English and knowledge to the next level. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep exploring the amazing world around you. I'm Danny. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time. And remember, never stop learning with English Plus Podcast.